Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. March 17th, 1861. In Turin, church bells rolled over slate roofs, and the winter air smelled of coal and candle wax as a tricolor climbed the flagpole and held. A proclamation named a single king over lands that had, for centuries, answered to dukes, popes, emperors, and the stubborn pride of their own walls. Courtyards filled with boots and murmurs. Copyists leaned into their presses. Boys on errands paused, staring up as if a new sky had been hung. Italy stood and called itself whole, not with the ageless certainty of Britain or France or Russia, but with the quiver of something newly born and unsure of its limbs. The moment was a coronation and a confession. Unity had come late to a peninsula that had long been a place rather than a nation, a map every army knew by heart and every city kept for itself. To understand why the word Italy once felt more geographical than political, begin with the way history pressed itself into these stones. The Alps funneled winters and wars. The Po Valley spread like a drumhead where hoofbeats traveled faster than decrees. Coasts opened to traders and invaders who arrived with both ledgers and lances. Spanish standards, French tricolors, Habsburg eagles, papal keys. Each had fluttered above the same fortress walls at different hours, as if the peninsula were a stage with a revolving set. Lombardy, especially, felt the churn of Europe's ambitions. Fields measured not only in harvests but in regiments that crossed them. Generation after generation learned the posture of living beneath banners that might change before a child became a soldier. Yet the more decisive reason for late unification lay closer to the ground, inside the boundaries that mattered most to ordinary lives. A Tuscan could love Florence the way a sailor loves a ship, the city's patron saint, dialect, guilds, and rivalries forming a compass truer than any distant crown. Venetians knew the taste of salt and cedar, counted time by tides and Senate votes. Milanese carried the pulse of trade through narrow streets, where looms and ledgers chattered in counterpoint. In Siena, the city walls were more than defense. They were memory-made brick, and the annual rhythm of festivals and processions gave a people their calendar of belonging. To belong to a city was to inherit a story already in motion, and that story, rich, proud, jealous, could eclipse the fragile, abstract promise of belonging to a country still unwritten. Other kingdoms paid a different price for their age. England had bent its barons and its borders to a single crown through centuries of war and law. France had hammered its provinces into a state whose monarchs could raise roads as well as armies. Russia had taught distance and winter to serve the will of an empire. Italy, by contrast, remained a choir of strong voices without a conductor, a tapestry whose threads glowed precisely because they were not yet woven together. The Renaissance had proved that brilliance could blaze without political unity, that Florentine pens and Venetian keels could remake Europe while princes squabbled over riverbanks. But glory bought in city coin rarely purchases national consolidation. Wealth dispersed across rival courts, sharpened local prestige, even as it blunted any appetite for dissolution into a larger whole. What changed over time was not a sudden outbreak of sentiment, but a slow, practical recalibration of advantage. Roads lengthened, carriages grew faster, and ideas traveled in the pockets of men who wrote by gaslight and spoke across borders. The printing press braided distant conversations. A newspaper in Turin could arrive in Genoa with yesterday's breath still on it. In cafe back rooms, in university halls with cold floors and hot debates, a generation began to test whether the arithmetic of unity, shared markets, shared defense, shared law, might add up to more than the polished pride of city independence. The notion did not ask old loyalties to vanish. It asked them to fit inside a newer, larger room. Even so, the past did not yield easily. The Papal States guarded their sovereignty with both doctrine and diplomacy, their territory stitched through the center of the peninsula like a seam that refused the tailor's needle. Austrian garrisons in Lombardy and Venetia stood as iron punctuation marks at the end of any sentence that spoke too quickly of independence. In the south, Bourbon rule anchored Naples to older arrangements, where loyalty and resentment braided together in ways that could not be pulled apart without pain. Foreign powers, seeing in Italy either a chessboard or a buffer, kept a careful hand on the table. Every step toward unity had to find space between what the peninsula desired and what Europe would tolerate. And yet the word Italy had already begun to change color inside the minds of people who had never met. A student in Pisa reading a Genoese pamphlet could feel the electric recognition of a problem phrased as if it were his own. A merchant in Milan negotiating rates with a partner in Bologna might notice how quickly profit grows when tolls shrink and laws align. A Sicilian veteran of French campaigns could remember barracks where dialects collided into a rough common speech, an accidental grammar for a nation that did not yet exist. The idea gathered not as a drum roll, but as a distant organ note, low and steady, telling listeners they were in the same room even if the doors between them were still shut. That is why the scene in Turin mattered beyond ceremony. The tricolor snapping against the cold made a promise that would need to be kept in provinces where the tricolor had never cast a shadow. The proclamation named Victor Emmanuel II, but the streets murmured older names: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, Rome, as if they were sovereigns being asked to abdicate into a federation of memory. It is one thing to draw a line around cities and call it a country. It is another to persuade people whose grandparents fought under different saints and sovereigns to lift their eyes to a horizon they share. In the space between ink and allegiance, history would have to labor. On that day, a boy ran through the alleys carrying a scrap of ribbon in the new colors, and an old tailor paused his needle to watch the flag he had never sewn rise from a pole he had mended more than once. In a rented room, a copyist set the type for a broadsheet printing the news, hands black with ink, lips moving as he read the words to himself. Far away, a fisherman in the Bay of Naples hauled a net that did not know the name of the king, while a Lombard farmer leaned on his spade and squinted at clouds that did not care for proclamations. Italy had been declared. The earth underfoot remained the same. In that quiet truth, the work ahead stood like a long road just visible beyond the city gate, pale in the light, waiting for feet to make it real. Before there was a nation, there were gates. Stone arches bearing a city's crest, customs posts where clerks weighed cloth and grain, bell towers that declared the hour not for Italy, but for Florence, for Venice, for Milan. Allegiance lived inside walls, to a commune, a lord, a patron saint, a dialect that tasted like home. The peninsula was a quilt of sovereignties stitched edge to edge, each square fiercely bright, none willing to fade into the next. Civic identity was not an abstraction. It was a daily choreography. In Florence, guild banners crowded the air, and bankers tallied debts that reached Paris while their loyalties never crossed the Arno. Venice ruled a floating empire of trade routes and warehouses, a republic of oars and councils where a doge wore gold but moved only as the law allowed. Genoa and Pisa wrestled over the sea lanes like rival captains fighting for the same wind. Milan, hard and iron-colored, looked to the Visconti and then the Sforza for the steadying hand of a prince who could keep the forges hot and the roads guarded. To call these places Italian would have sounded like calling a family by the name of the street. People belonged first to their city, and the city belonged to itself. Power arranged itself through a restless balance. Leagues formed and melted. Alliances signed at noon were doubted by dusk. Mercenary captains, the condottieri, sold discipline in regiments, their contracts as intricate as any fresco, and their loyalty measured in coin and calculation. Sieges could be cautious dances, arithmetic with cannon. Battles sometimes ended with order restored rather than enemies destroyed, because profit preferred continuity. Statesmen sharpened diplomacy into an art, measuring moves the way jewelers weigh stones, carefully, slowly, with an ear for what a neighbor could tolerate without reaching for a sword. Then the drumbeat on the horizon grew into marching feet. In 1494, Charles VIII of France stepped over the Alpine threshold and turned what Italians called politics into what the rest of Europe called war. The Italian wars, Valois France and Habsburg Spain wrestling for mastery, poured foreign armies onto Lombardy's flat fields and through the passes to Naples. Pavia in 1525 caged a French king. 2 years later, the sack of Rome blackened frescoes and scattered cardinals, as if the heart of Christendom had been shaken by its own ribcage. Historians would later say the peninsula became Europe's proving ground, and Lombardy its great anvil, where France and Spain tested steel while Italian city-states paid the bill in blood and coin. Overlordship thickened like winter fog. In the north, the Holy Roman Empire's claims ran like faint watermark lines over maps that still insisted Milan and Venice chose their own fates. In the center, papal keys unlocked not only doctrine, but territory, with the Pope a prince among princes. In the south, Aragonese and then Spanish crowns gripped Naples and Sicily with the seasoned hand of a maritime power. Dynastic marriages stitched distant thrones to Italian dowries, while imperial ambassadors kept lodgings that looked suspiciously permanent. By the time treaties at Cateau Cambrésis ended the long storm in 1559, Spain's shadow lay across much of the peninsula, and Austria watched Lombardy with the patience of a landlord who has paid in advance. And yet, in the same centuries when armies scraped their names into stone, the cities wrote brighter ones in ink and paint. Dante gave a tongue to longing and judgment. Petrarch and Boccaccio tuned it. Later, Machiavelli bent prose until it described power with the chill clarity of a drawn blade. Workshops breathed color into walls until saints seemed to stand on marble floors. Architects taught space to lift and curve like prayer. Venetian presses spilled cheap books by the armload, making a common reading culture long before a common flag. But brilliance did not imply obedience. Florence's pride was not Rome's, and the quickness of Tuscan speech did not yet bind Piedmont to Calabria. Art, trade, law, and letters traveled. Sovereignty stayed at home. The economy itself hardened the borders even as it crossed them. Venetian convoys ran like clockwork. Genoa's bankers became the treasurers of empires. The Po Valley turned grain into cash, and cash into soldiers. Tariffs, tolls, and the rites of passage formed a tangle of incentives that made unity seem, at best, a romantic poem with poor bookkeeping. Why surrender a tax farm or a charter of ancient privilege to a larger body that might spend revenue elsewhere? For many elites, the Italian question did not concern identity so much as arithmetic. If a larger state could offer cheaper credit, safer trade, and a reliable army perhaps, but only perhaps, the ledger would justify the flag. Religion too divided and defended. The papal states lay like a belt across the peninsula's middle, with castles for buckles and legates for holes. Popes negotiated with emperors and kings as equals, guarding both souls and roads. To imagine a nation passing through this belt without unfastening it first was to imagine water running uphill. Meanwhile, the Counter-Reformation set a tone: discipline, order, boundaries held tight. In such a climate, innovation in painting or architecture might be welcomed, but political experimentation, especially anything smelling of Republican radicalism, was watched as closely as an unfamiliar pilgrim near the sanctum. And always, across the centuries, the map trembled to distant decisions. A squadron raised in Toulon could tilt a balance in Lombardy months later. A marriage in Madrid could rearrange the customs house at Piacenza. A death in Vienna could put a new price on the salt trade in Ferrara. Italy was central to Europe's ambitions and yet peripheral to its own destiny, a paradox that bred both ingenuity and caution. Cities played a long game of survival, preferring clever neutrality or tactical fealty to a grand vision that had no treasury to fund it or sword to defend it. By the dawn of the Renaissance and after, the habit of thinking in city scale remained the peninsula's strongest muscle. Festivals rehearsed belonging each year with saints lifted on shoulders and banners rippling down narrow streets. Law courts rendered justice in dialect. Archives preserved 1,000 contracts proving who owed whom for a barrel of oil or a life. Men schooled on Livy could speak of Rome with reverence, but the Rome they meant was marble and memory, not a government they obeyed. The word Italy lingered as geography and culture, a melody shared by many instruments, while the conductors were princes, councils, and clerics, with no wish to cede the baton. So the stage that awaited unification was crowded and well lit. Towers, domes, and harbor masts, guild halls and chancelleries, marching columns whose drums echoed off the same walls that sheltered poets and printers. Foreign standards came and went like seasons. Local banners endured, salt-stained, smoke-scarred, repaired, and re-raised. In the evening, when market stalls were shuttered and soldiers counted pay in courtyards smelling of straw, a traveler could walk from one gate to another and cross 3 jurisdictions without ever leaving the same city. The peninsula breathed as many small chests, not one, and the sound it made was a polyphony, beautiful, defiant, and for the task ahead, obstinately out of unison. The Renaissance arrived like dawn through stained glass, fractured, prismatic, irresistible, and it rose first where money and movement were strongest. In Florence, wool and banking paid for chapels that taught stone to breathe. In Venice, shipyards beat time for a republic that counted horizons like coins. Artists and architects made the sacred practical and the practical divine, translating devotion into geometry and trade into glory. In the tight weave of streets, you could hear a theology of measurement take shape. Proportion as piety, perspective as proof that the world could be drawn into order. In that light, language itself grew a backbone and a pulse. Dante climbed through hell and up the mountain by way of a Tuscan tongue forged like a tool, binding common speech to universal judgment. Petrarch and Boccaccio tuned the instrument until it could sing of cities and sinners with the same authority as scriptures and kings. A people could now hear themselves in the words that weighed them, and the cadence of a peninsula began to collect around syllables that did not need Latin to sound eternal. But if the Renaissance made Italians legible to themselves, it did not make them obedient to one another. The same Florentines who financed frescoes argued over constitutions and exiles. The same Venetians who balanced columns against domes, balanced merchants against nobles in councils that never surrendered sovereignty to anyone beyond the lagoon. Rival courts patronized rival geniuses, each court a star that refused a constellation. Beauty, it turned out, could run on local fuel indefinitely, requiring no national grid. Then came the desk where a civil servant named Niccolò sharpened a quill until it could cut illusions. Machiavelli wrote not to flatter princes, but to strip power to the chassis. Fear and favor, the coin and knife of the realm. He loved the antique virtue he called virtu, the capacity to seize the hour and bend fortune's wheel, and he hated the softness that left cities prey to mercenaries and foreign crowns. His pages do not dream of a centralized state so much as insist that any state that would live must first refuse self-deception. Elsewhere, another Florentine, Cesare Borgia's chronicler, eager and appalled, found in the Duke the terrifying efficiency of a man unburdened by scruple. Cesare did not build cathedrals. He built moments where hesitation died. He stitched Romagna together with decisive cruelty, then lost everything when fortune turned and papal winds shifted. To some, he appeared as the prototype of what unification would require, a will sharp enough to fuse territories that had never wished to touch. And yet, for all the talk of princes and republics, the engine remained commerce. In Milan, silk and iron rubbed shoulders in markets where the price of bolts and brocade rose and fell like tides. In Venice, laws braided insurance to ambition, so ships could chase profit beyond any map the state could safely patrol. The Medici learned how interest could place a family on a throne while pretending to descend from it. Money moved faster than armies, and, unlike armies, needed no permission to cross a border carved yesterday. The arts embodied this confidence not as decoration, but as a governing principle. Brunelleschi spanned a cathedral with a dome that appeared to float on reasons, not miracles. Alberti described a city as a machine for living well, drafting virtue into facades and plazas. Painters discovered that space could be taught to obey lines converging toward a vanishing point, and that the human body, studied with the patience once reserved for relics, could make holiness visible. These were not trivialities. They were a pedagogy in which citizens learned to trust tools of their own making. Meanwhile, presses turned night into a second day for those who set type. Venetian publishers learned that a small, cheap book can travel like a rumor and survive like a seed, and soon a clerk in Ferrara could hold the same argument in his hands as a student in Padua. Law and satire, plays and polemics navigated a republic of letters whose borders were drawn by roots and readers rather than by dukes. The more men and women read, the more they rehearsed a habit essential to citizenship, consenting to be persuaded by reasons other than their own. All this brilliance flared inside stubborn frames. City statutes codified rivalries so ancient they were as natural as weather. Guilds guarded privileges that kept craftsmen fed and competitors outside the gate. A Florentine might quote Dante to a Sienese and still refuse to trust him with a tax. A Venetian might admire a Tuscan facade and still prefer the Doge's slow caution to the quickness of any distant reformer. The Renaissance could harmonize taste across distances, but power remained very local and very proud. The map of patrons reflects the map of politics. You could trace Medici money through Florence's chapels and offices like veins through a hand, each commission a pulse that kept the city alive and the family at its heart. In Venice, the Republic's self-image demanded art that projected stability and ceremony. Pageantry laid like lacquer over a complex balance of interests. Milan, under the Sforza, commissioned fortifications and music with equal fervor, as if to declare that a city could occupy both the battlefield and the ballroom without contradiction. Each center broadcast a message. We are complete. In the chanceries and counting houses, another truth pressed its case. Cohesion is cheaper than fragmentation when roads improve and markets interlock. Caravans needed consistent tolls, invoices needed predictable law, and the time a wagon lost at a customs post was a cost nobody could paint away. A handful of lawyers and merchants began to speak of uniformity, not as poetry, but as a savings account. Their whispers carried less romance than Dante and less fire than Machiavelli, yet they measured out the reasons a future statesman would later count on paper. And still, the peninsula would not close ranks. The Papal States remained a theological and territorial power, a spine of authority running through the waste of Italy that no prince could ignore and no parliament could yet replace. Austria watched the northern plains with the patient attention of a creditor. Spain's long reach still curled around Neapolitan politics, making the south a theater where local actors performed under foreign lighting. While artists painted saints and merchants priced pepper, the geometry of force kept its compass pressed into the soil. By century's end, the Atlantic called like a new ocean in the ear. Portugal, then Spain, then the Dutch and English learned to bind continents by wake and wind. The wealth that had once stopped at Italian keys began to sail past them, rounding capes that maps had not yet agreed upon. Venice tried calculation, Genoa tried partnerships, Florence leaned into manufacture, Milan into metal, each city adjusting, none confessing decline. The Renaissance glow remained, but the center of gravity had shifted, and with it, the arithmetic that once favored city over nation. Even as the light thinned, its afterglow lingered. Streets still rehearsed festivals. Ateliers still smelled of gesso and oil. Presses still rattled, and the noon bell still threw pigeons into the air. A traveler crossing from Bologna to Florence could watch hills fold and unfold like green origami, and feel that he moved inside a single civilization stitched by art and appetite, even as every toll gate insisted otherwise. The peninsula had taught Europe how to see and count and argue. It had not taught itself how to bow to one center without breaking. Evening gathered on the domes and campanili, and the bronze doors kept their stories, heavy and bright, while beyond the horizon a new commerce unrolled its darker, colder sea. After the blaze of the Renaissance, the light did not go out so much as tilt westward. Wind and wealth that had once filled Venetian sails now drove heavier hulls across the Atlantic, and the gold that once paused in Genoese counting houses swept past them toward London and Amsterdam. Italian quays still rang with hammers and hawkers, but the horizon had changed, and the Adriatic felt narrower than it had in the days when convoys moved like processions. In workshops and chancelleries, men copied the same contracts and stamped the same seals, while beyond their windows the world reweighted itself, and the peninsula, brilliant, busy, proud, found itself one step off the new axis. Dynastic wars redrew the peninsula without resolving it. Treaties carved and swapped territories like tiles on a mosaic. Austrian eagles spread over Lombardy. Bourbons gripped Naples and Sicily. Savoy grew into Sardinia's crown. The Papal States held their belt across the middle as if it were part of the earth's crust. Each transfer came with new uniforms and familiar taxes, with censuses and cadasters that promised order in the language of ledgers. Local elites learned to bow to distant rulers the way a merchant bows to the weather, accommodating, alert, unwilling to mistake compliance for belief. Garrison drums were a timepiece you could set your life to. The map's colors changed less often than the price of salt. Beneath the grand politics, the economy hardened into grooves it knew too well. Guild rules guarded crafts as jealously as city walls guarded streets. Toll barriers and petty sovereignties turned a wagon road into a string of traps where hours and coins fell away together. In the north, Mezzadria bound sharecroppers to plots measured by custom as much as by acre. In the south, great estates sprawled like sleeping animals, their shadows long over villages that lived from harvest to harvest. Banditry rose and fell with the grain and the tax collector. Reformist proclamations harvested applause and then withered in the field. The arithmetic of unity still looked bad to those who counted in privileges and monopolies, and good intentions died at customs houses where officials weighed barrels as if they were balancing history. Yet the century was not empty. Its quiet had edges. In Milan and across Austrian Lombardy, administrators tutored by Maria Theresa and Joseph II measured land, simplified taxes, nudged schools toward usefulness, and tried to make the law legible to people who had long paid lawyers to read it for them. In Tuscany, a methodical prince pushed through reforms with a bookkeeper's patience. Torture went first, the death penalty next, until a small state announced with startling calm that the sovereign would no longer kill. Livorno's free port opened like a lung, drawing in merchants who spoke in more currencies than languages. For a moment, it seemed that reason, gently applied, could do what armies had failed to, make life better without uprooting loyalties. But reason travels slower than shock, and papal censors and conservative councils could still bring a quiet room down on a novel idea like a lid on a jar. Culture persisted, recast for a new century. In Naples, a pupil walked to lessons past lava stones that remembered fire, and the conservatories made music that traveled faster than reform. In Milan, a new theater raised its chandeliers and declared with velvet that a city could stage its own greatness even when it did not govern its fate. Printers inked Enlightenment treatises in one column and devotional manuals in the next. Philosophers debated the social contract while notaries drafted contracts that looked blessedly the same as last year's. Along riverbanks, silk filatures hummed with water wheels and hands. In Piedmontese valleys, proto-factories learned to multiply cloth and metal on schedules that obeyed machinery rather than saints' days. You could smell modernity's first oil on the same air as incense. The weather of the century could turn violent. Earth shifted in Calabria, and churches fell with prayers still in them. Ash-dusted vineyards when the mountain coughed. A long winter or a wet spring could make hunger bloom where prosperity had been planted. Bourbon rule in the south flexed and faltered, capable of enlightened edicts and abrupt crackdowns, while Austrian prefects in the north kept order with a tidy severity that made rebellion look romantic and costly at once. The Papal States, mindful stewards of both doctrine and tolls, defended a rhythm of authority that had lasted longer than any dynasty, and regarded proposals for sweeping change as a sign that the proposer was too young to remember how many changes the world had already survived. The peninsula was not asleep, it was braced. Even so, ideas seeped through shutters and under doors. Lodges and salons rehearsed the new grammar of rights and citizenship, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in wine-warmed voices that forgot who might be listening. A lawyer in Bologna argued that law should be a promise rather than a puzzle. A merchant in Turin learned that a consistent tariff could be as patriotic as a poem. A schoolmaster in Parma told boys that history had authors and that some of them were men who had begun as nobodies. Soldiers who had marched in foreign service came home with stories of conscripted equality that were equal parts grievance and gospel. By the time anyone realized that arguments can march like regiments, the sound of boots was already in the passes. The shock, when it came, wore tricolor cockades and the smell of wet wool. French cannon wrote new punctuation into old fortresses. Proclamations nailed to doors tried to teach citizens to say "nation" without lowering their voices. A generation raised under the steady metronome of dynastic Europe discovered that the measure could change overnight, that roads widen when fear runs ahead of it, and that a tax ledger can be turned into a recruitment roll with one hard decision. The forgotten centuries had not been wasted. They had been a long intake of breath, cities practicing survival while the world turned. Now the breath went out. The Alps that had slowed invasion became a path for it. The customs posts where officials weighed cloth and grain weighed loyalty instead. In the gray light of a Lombard morning, a sentry leaned on a musket and watched a column approach, flags wet from rain, drums finding the echo that walls had saved for centuries, and the calm of a familiar order, that velvet quiet, lifted like dust before a marching line. They came over the mountains as if the Alps were only a fold in a map, blue coats dark with meltwater, tricolor cockades bleeding color into the snow. Cannon wheels bit into the stone like teeth. Sappers cut steps where goats had picked their way for centuries, and behind them came proclamations neat enough to pin on doors that had known only edicts in Latin and threats in dialect. Napoleon's army of Italy moved with the quick arithmetic of appetite and intention. Pay the troops with the enemy's treasure, win battles that feed battles. And the old chessboard of dukes and communes woke to find a new player who overturned not only pieces but the very rules. In the spring glare of 1796, Lombardy's flatlands became a parade ground for a future speaking in the present tense. The shock was administrative before it was sentimental. Departments replaced duchies. Prefects arrived with folders and clocks. Registers filled with names written the same way from village to village, as if the state had decided to teach handwriting in order to recognize itself wherever it looked. The code traveled like a portable courthouse, whispering that contracts should be clear, property secure, and guilt determined by evidence rather than recollection. Italians who had learned to navigate a maze of charters and immunities suddenly glimpsed the brutal seduction of straight lines. A state that could count, and by counting, command. Every promise had a price tag stamped on its underside. Requisitions were taken in the name of liberty and paid for in IOUs that slept poorly in a baker's till. Conscription turned villages into a lottery where the unlucky left with drums and tears, and the lucky learned the art of looking grateful. The metrics of the revolution, meters and liters, francs and schedules, were laid over old habits like a grid over a vineyard that insisted on climbing where it pleased. Yet even resentment learned a new vocabulary. Citizens quarreled with prefects using words they had not owned before, and petitions, once the property of guilds and notables, began to arrive with signatures stacked like steps. War remade the roads, and roads remade the work. Bridges that had been picturesque became useful. Swamps were drained with a quartermaster's impatience, not a monk's patience. And inland towns found themselves drawn into circuits of supply that behaved like markets, even when they were only armies hungry for nails and bread. Workshops in Lombardy stretched their hours to meet contracts for cloth, boots, harness, shot. In Piedmont, water wheels learned new tricks in filatures where silk ran through fingers that now measured time by shifts. Historians would call it a minor industrial revolution, but it did not feel minor to the men who installed the first iron frames in a shed that began to sound like a future. The map, always the peninsula's favorite literature, was rewritten as a primer in centralization. Cisalpine, Ligurian, Roman republics. Names rose and fell like tents after a campaign, but the tent poles were the same: uniform law, consistent taxes, men in uniform who demanded receipts and salutes with equal confidence. Church lands were inventoried and sold, not as acts of philosophy, but as items in a ledger that needed balancing. Monasteries found that centuries of silence did not protect a door against a clerk with keys. When the Italian Republic became the Kingdom of Italy with Napoleon as its king, the pageantry only confirmed what clerks and captains already knew. This was an experiment in making a nation by teaching it the habits of a state. Not everyone learned willingly, and many learned only the lesson they had expected. The peasant who watched sons vanish down the road with muskets remembered only the year the harvest lost its hands. The merchant who opened his shutters to find new tariffs applauded one month and cursed the next. But in city after city, a stratum of men and a few visible women Lawyers, engineers, printers, contractors, professors prospered by mastering the new grammar. They are the ones later generations would recognize in portraits. Patriots in waistcoats, hair brushed toward the future, pocket watches kept by Paris time. Politics seeped into rooms where accounts were done. Lodges and clubs taught men to sit in circles and speak in proposals. Newspapers amplified the habit of imagining strangers as fellow readers before they were fellow citizens. In the hills and ports, secret societies, names whispered like passwords, carbonari among them, wove threads between towns that had once known one another only as rivals in salt or silk. An officer trained to maneuver battalions began to maneuver sentiments instead, discovering that a rumor can be marched along a road if one posts it like a picket at each cafe. Then, as quickly as he had arrived, the man at the center fell away. The same roads that had carried victories out of Italy now carried defeats back into it. The same presses that had printed decrees now printed abdications. The same bells that had rung for constitutions rang, with a more familiar tone, for masses of thanksgiving. In 1814 and 1815, the Restoration returned Bourbons to Naples, Austrians to Lombardy and Venetia, popes to wider powers, colors repainted on the old mosaic with the assurance of a landlord reclaiming his house. Crowds cheered the end of conscription and the end of strangers' calendars. Sighs of relief dragged on like aftershocks. Relief, however, is not the same as amnesia. Prefects left, filing cabinets stayed. Young men who had learned to read military maps now read political ones, and the measure of a good road was no longer only how quickly a gun could cross it, but how easily a newspaper could arrive. Merchants who had enjoyed the clean arithmetic of uniform customs did not forget the taste. Students who had memorized the language of rights under French syllabi did not unlearn it when the teacher changed. The Restoration restored thrones. It could not unmint the coinage of expectation. In Naples, a shopkeeper who had watched tricolor ribbons fade in his window tied a scrap of them into the drawer where he kept accounts, a private ledger of sentiment. In Milan, a clerk returned the metric ruler to his desk and used the old measures in public, the new ones in his mind. In Bologna, a veteran hung his cockade behind a holy picture where no visitor would see it, but every morning prayer would pass it. Across the peninsula, the paperwork of Napoleon's years lay in archives and in habits, forms, fonts, formulas, and the unquiet sense that a country could be made to move as one if someone someday could pay the price. Evening fell on barracks repainted in older colors, and the roads, widened, straightened, surveyed, held a memory of columns that had taught Italians to march to the same beat, even after the drummer had gone. The map that returned after 1815 looked familiar because it had been designed to be. At Vienna, diplomats reset the peninsula like a clock they believed had been running too fast, placing Bourbons back in Naples and Sicily, restoring the Pope's temporal span across the center, confirming Tuscany under a Habsburg-Lorraine line, and handing Lombardy Venetia to Austria with the confidence of a creditor reclaiming collateral. Savoy's house sat in Piedmont, Sardinia, with a wary pride, a small crown with a long memory. Uniforms repainted shutters and regiments repopulated barracks. But something in the grain of daily life had changed, and no amount of ceremony could sand it smooth. Metternich's age hardened into a climate of caution. Censors sat beside editors' inkpots as if they were a second color. Police prefects practiced the art of reading between lines. Passports turned movement into a privilege signed by everyone except the traveler. In the cafes of Milan and Bologna, conversations widened and then narrowed when a new face appeared. In Naples, a rumor could fill a quarter before sundown and vanish without leaving a single word on paper. The Restoration did not pretend to erase the French decade. It aimed instead to padlock its tools, code, press, assembly, behind polite ritual, hoping that dust would do the rest. Meanwhile, the arithmetic of space was changing again, but this time the numbers were local and incremental. Roads were straightened not to rush battalions, but to bring oranges faster to markets. Bridges were rebuilt with a craftsman's pride and a banker's calculation. Canals carried timber and grain toward cities, learning to think in schedules. Steam rolled into the harbors, cautious at first, and then inevitable screw and paddle turning the old coastlines into timetables. In Naples, a short railway crept from city to seaside, a novelty for picnics and princes. In Lombardy, another line stitched one town to the next with iron thread, a seam that even a censor could not unpick. Merchants and manufacturers learned the feel of a larger ledger. A mill in Piedmont could now seek cotton by river and sell cloth by road without bribing 3 toll-keepers and 2 saints. A banker in Genoa compounded his sums with interest from Turin to Livorno and began to suspect that Italy might yet be an accounting term with political consequences. In workshops, gears turned by water and then by engines, and the regular thrum made men think in hours instead of saints' days. Sober minds that cared nothing for poetry began to murmur that predictability, uniform tariffs, unified law might be profit by another name. But even as commerce rehearsed unity, governments reasserted the music of division. In Rome, papal decrees moved with the deliberation of an institution that measured change against centuries. Reforms entered like pilgrims and often left as heretics. In the duchies, enlightened cousins issued edicts with a schoolmaster's optimism, only to discover that a bad harvest makes doctrine brittle. Bourbon officials in the South alternated between competent administration and whiplash repression, as if the only 2 tools at hand were a ledger and a cudgel. Austria's Lombardy and Venetia, efficient and surveilled, profited from order that felt like a wall, handsome and high. Politics went indoors, then underground. Old lodges changed passwords. New circles formed around piano lids and medical lectures, where anatomy or sonatas covered, for an hour, the dissection of a country not yet born. The Carbonari lit charcoal braziers and swore oaths in rooms that smelled of smoke and secrecy, inventing rituals to stand against rituals older than nations. Their conspiracies sped through roads that gendarmes patrolled. Their manifestos climbed the same staircases as tax notices. Their leaders, lawyers, officers, professors, learned to move between daylight and dusk without creaking a floorboard. The uprisings, when they came, were rehearsals as much as revolts. In 1820-21, Naples tested the word constitution and found that Austria could march it back across the border. Piedmont tried to breathe the same air and discovered how quickly a crown can cough it out. In 1831, Modena miscalculated the courage of a duke, Bologna misread the patience of Rome. Both learned that enthusiasms must cross more than one city wall to become history. Each failure, however, left sediment, contacts, maps, a handful of men accustomed to command, and a larger handful accustomed to facing a firing line and not blinking. While policemen kept lists, printers kept plates, and a language for shared indignation grew. Pamphlets written in clear Italian, polished by Florentine habits, and spread by Venetian cunning, taught readers to recognize themselves in people they had never met. Histories of Rome and Livy's stern lessons returned with a new clothing. The ancient republic as mirror for the modern conscience, where corruption and faction were not metaphors but diagnoses. The idea of Italy learned to walk on prose, and in walking, it stepped over dialect without claiming to erase it. The middle class, still small, still tenuous, began to behave like connective tissue. Engineers who had laid roads for dukes found themselves petitioned by towns that wanted bridges for trade. Lawyers arguing inheritance one week wrote petitions about press freedom the next. Doctors who inoculated against smallpox criticized the fevers that swept through the body politic when censorship drove ideas into the bloodstream. Even among nobles, a few restless heirs invested in factories, discovering that a well-run spinning floor can feel as noble as a well-run estate when wage packets go out on time and returns come in neat columns. Every province taught its own lesson. In Lombardy, the calm surface of Austrian legality convinced even skeptics that states could be both powerful and predictable. In Tuscany, a tradition of measured reform suggested that decency was possible if nerves were steady. In the south, the distance between palace and campo sharpened the taste of grievance until songs did the work of speeches. The Papal States demonstrated, with the obstinacy of a granite altar, that some sovereignties cannot be amended without first settling the question of who, if anyone, is allowed to amend God. Across all of this moved men whose names would soon be spoken as if they had always belonged together. Mazzini wrote from exile with the faith of a man composing liturgy. Cavour practiced arithmetic until it sounded like strategy. Garibaldi learned to march men through chaos as if it were weather. They did not yet command armies or cabinets. They commanded attention in certain rooms and a longing in others. Their letters crossed borders with the nimbleness of birds. Their reputations crossed faster than their letters. By the late 1840s, the peninsula felt like a dry hillside where a storm was traveling by rumor toward it. Harvests failed in parts, prices rose in others, and the hunger that followed knew how to turn anger into a procession. People who had never said nation aloud said it once in a whisper, and then again, louder, in a street where neighbors could hear and nod. The Austrian boot tapped a steady rhythm in Milan. The Pope's guards drilled within earshot of prayers. Bourbon patrols spun the alleys of Naples like tops. And still, the roads continued to lengthen, the rails to settle, the timetables to circulate. Quiet arithmetic with a revolutionary answer. When night fell in those years, a traveler could stand on a ridge above the Po and watch lamps thread the roads like beads, each bead a town with its own saints, its own council, its own stubborn pride. He could also hear, far off, the exhalation of a locomotive and know that the line it followed, iron laid across jurisdictions, cared nothing for heraldry. The map insisted on fragments. The horizon suggested a sentence waiting to be spoken as one breath. Somewhere, a telegraph key clicked, and a clerk folded a newspaper still warm from the press, while in a courtyard, a constable tightened his cloak against the chill and listened, puzzled, to the faint metallic heartbeat of a future he could not arrest. He worked as if history were a long letter he had to finish before dawn. In a damp upstairs room in Marseille, then London, then wherever exile rented by the month, Giuseppe Mazzini bent over paper while the street below learned to sleep without him. He wrote addresses to soldiers and artisans, catechisms for a people that did not yet exist, and circulars that crossed borders rolled inside boots or stitched into coat linings. A policeman might stand under the eaves listening for a conspiracy. What he heard was the scratch of a pen trying to turn conscience into a country. Mazzini had been born in the port of Genoa, where hills fall into water and ships teach boys the geography of hunger and hope. He studied law and learned early that regulations can tidy injustice without curing it. The Carbonari gave him a first grammar of revolt and a first lesson in futility. Arrest and brief confinement convinced him that secret societies needed not only courage, but doctrine. Exile gave him time to write it. In 1831, he named his program Giovine Italia, Young Italy, and swore it to three plain pillars: God, the people, and the Republic. His faith was not a parish one. It was civic, providential, severe. He took for granted that history has a moral direction and that nations are instruments chosen to play it, each with a duty to raise its own voice without borrowing a trumpet from an empire. He looked at the peninsula's habits of local pride and foreign patronage and called them vices to be overcome by education, sacrifice, and a universal, because human, claim to dignity. The republic he preached was not a set of offices, but a school. Citizens learning to act for one another because they had been taught, from pulpit and classroom and press, to see one another as brothers rather than rivals. His methods were a braid of sermon and spark. In letters to the Italian working men, in manifestos passed hand to hand in porticos and cafes, he invited shoemakers and students into the same sentence, promising that a nation could be made by those who toiled as well as by those who commanded. He favored insurrection when conscience demanded it, small risings that could teach courage even if they failed to seize a city, and he believed failure, rightly suffered, could ripen into a future victory. In 1833, the police struck his network in Piedmont. In 1834, his attempt to ignite Savoy limped and fell. Yet with each defeat, the map of sympathizers thickened, like ink seeping through paper to reveal an image on the other side. Young Italy functioned less like a club than like an apostolate. Initiations read like vows. Meetings felt like liturgy stripped of incense. Couriers memorized 2 or 3 phrases and a route. Women hosted salons where sheet music covered discussions of gunpowder and where a piano's closed lid hid pamphlets better than any lockbox. Donations came in coins and in hours stolen from sleep, and the receipts were kept in memory because paper burns. Surveillance made martyrs. Exile made missionaries, and London, with its soot and freedoms, became Mazzini's second homeland and his largest printing press. When the year 1848 shook Europe, he stepped from pamphlet to pavement. In Rome, as the Pope fled and the Republic declared itself, Mazzini shared the triumvirate with Armellini and Saffi, and the city became briefly a stage for his creed. The death penalty was abolished. The press breathed without a hand on its throat. Church and state were pried apart with a reformer's care and a surgeon's speed. Then French troops, sent by a president soon to be emperor, broke the defense and brought the papal keys back to temporal locks. Mazzini slipped again into exile with the taste of a republic's promise in his mouth, like bread left half-eaten. Failure did not moderate him, it clarified him. He remained suspicious of monarchs who wore liberal phrases like borrowed coats, and of diplomats who spoke of Italy as a corridor between their wars. He hated the thought of unification purchased at the price of subservience to Paris or Vienna, and he said so with the certainty of a man who puts obedience to principle above ease. Where others weighed outcomes, he weighed duties. Where they gamed alliances, he discipled consciences. And if the arithmetic of the next decade would prove him often impractical, it also proved him indispensable as a tutor of will. The reach of his vision was national and, in its way, international. With young Europe, he proposed that peoples, Poles, Germans, Hungarians, Italians, were not competitors in a bazaar, but co-laborers in a moral project, each raising a free nation to build a just continent. He taught English lessons to poor children in London, and then went home to write Italian lessons for adults who had not known they were citizens. He knew that literacy carries not merely words, but duties. He composed letters into an ethics of belonging, insisting that rights without responsibilities turn a republic into a market, and that markets without meaning turn citizens into customers. He did not walk alone. Mazzini's friendships were a scaffolding as important as his texts. Expatriate printers who risked presses and prison, sea captains who tucked envelopes into cargoes of soap and rope, widows who turned their front rooms into post offices of hope. He corresponded with women who would not be barred from a politics that claimed to honor the people. He scolded the young when they mistook bravado for bravery. He could be hard on friends, harder on himself, and hardest of all on compromises that appeared to him as disguised defeats. Time bent his edges but never softened his core. If anything, years annealed him. By the late 1850s, his influence was paradoxical, everywhere and displaced, magnetic and marginal. In the cafes where students rehearsed courage over bitter coffee, his name drew nods. In cabinets where ministers planned, it drew sighs. To Cavour's reckoners, he was a beautiful danger, a man whose purity might wreck a carefully built bridge. To Garibaldi's storm, he was both a lighthouse and an impatient bell. He had insisted for decades that Italy must free itself with its own hands. The next moves would involve foreign gloves and royal signatures. And so the apostles' work encountered the strategist's hour. The people Mazzini had taught to imagine a nation would soon be asked to accept one fashioned by diplomacy and war, by bargains struck in palaces, and by boots that marched without asking theology for permission. He would loathe parts of it, resist other parts, and yet recognize in its rise the echo of the duties he had preached: sacrifice, solidarity, a moral claim to independence. On a London night long after the Roman dream had fallen, Mazzini blew out a candle beside a stack of pamphlets that smelled of ink and damp wool, and for a moment he listened to the quiet as if it were the breath of a multitude already on the road he had marked in words. He did not look like a revolutionary. He looked like a problem solver with a crowded desk. In Turin's ministries, the air smelled of damp paper and coal, and Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, moved pins on a map the way a surveyor chooses where to lay a bridge. He ran his fingers not over swords, but over figures, tariffs, loans, rail mileage, and each number was an argument for why a small kingdom might grow into something that could be mistaken for a nation. He trusted methods the way other men trusted miracles, and his politics spoke in the cool grammar of cause and consequence. Cavour had been trained in uniforms and disappointed by them. A younger son of the Piedmontese nobility, he served as an officer and resigned rather than salute stupidity, then taught himself the price of wheat and the chemistry of soil at his family estate of Larry. England's factories and parliaments fascinated him. He learned how steam organizes time and how a chamber tames passion into policy, and he came home to make Piedmont modern at the pace of a ledger. By 1847, he was editing Il Risorgimento. After the 1848 Constitution, he entered Parliament, and in 1852, by fusing moderates and pragmatic leftists in the connubio with Retazzi, he took the premiership, a civilian at the throttle of a state. He governed by tightening bolts others had left loose. Railways crawled out of Turin, joined by telegraphs that made thunder with their fingers. Ports and canals were trimmed to shave minutes from trade. Banks learned to risk with discipline because the state would not change the rules mid-game. He trimmed priestly privileges with the 1855 ecclesiastical reform, not out of hatred for faith but to make the budget answer to arithmetic. And he coined a watchword, a free church in a free state, that sounded like harmony and felt like a fight. What he wanted most was credibility, for investors abroad to treat Piedmont not as a mountain province, but as a promise that kept its receipts. The peninsula, however, was not a spreadsheet. To loosen Austria's hand from Lombardy and Venetia, Cavour needed a chair at the high table of Europe, and he bought it with blood he could afford to spend. In 1855, he sent Sardinian troops to the Crimea, a small contingent to a far war that earned him a seat at the Paris Congress of 1856. There, between maps of the Black Sea and the Danube, he spoke the Italian question into the record, persuading Napoleon III that there was glory and advantage in cutting Habsburg fingers from the Po. In 1858, at Plombières, under Alpine air and imperial irony, he arranged the bargain. France would come if Austria struck first. Lombardy would be Sardinia's prize. Nice and Savoy, perhaps, the price to be paid later. He accepted even the matrimonial theater, Prince Napoleon to Clotilde of Savoy, because dynastic knots sometimes bind canons to promises. If Mazzini preached and Garibaldi would one day charge, Cavour calibrated. He massaged the press, subsidized the National Society to make annexation look like public desire, and treated plebiscites as the respectable clothes that power wears when it steps out in daylight. He ringed Austria with provocations delicate enough to be called maneuvers and obvious enough to be read as insults. In April 1859, Vienna sent an ultimatum, which he rejected with the solemnity of a man whose trap has sprung. French troops arrived. Magenta and Solferino bled their names into the fields. Then, with a flourish of imperial nerves, Napoleon III negotiated the armistice at Villafranca that left Venetia under Austria and Cavour livid enough to resign. He returned because the story had not finished counting. Even with Villafranca, Lombardy passed to Sardinia. In central Italy, Parma, Modena, Tuscany, local uprisings and careful orchestration produced plebiscites that spoke the magic phrase, union with Piedmont. To secure French blessing, he paid the bill negotiated in advance. Nice and Savoy yielded to France, a cession that burned like salt in Garibaldi's mouth. When Garibaldi's 1,000 seized Sicily and rolled up the Bourbon south, Cavour moved the Piedmontese army through the papal marches, beating the Pope's troops at Castelfidardo, not to punish Rome, but to keep the red shirts from marching into it and turning a European question into a European crisis. The pace turned breathless. Naples fell, plebiscites ratified the South's annexation, and on a dusty road near Teano, Garibaldi saluted Victor Emmanuel as king, ceding his conquest to a crown he did not love. Cavour had the thing he wanted in outline, a kingdom of Italy that reached from the Alps to almost the gates of Rome, with Venice still withheld by Austria and the Holy City still guarded by France. He threaded a government through regions that had shared everything except obedience, law codes patched, tariffs pulled into line, ministers set to work as if the country had always existed and merely misplaced its stationery. If the result felt prosaic beside the romance of rebellion, that was the point. To turn amazement into routine before amazement had time to panic. His methods created enemies and a future. Clerics denounced him as a thief of altars. Republicans damned him as a thief of dreams. Conservatives distrusted the speed at which he made old privileges obey new rules. Yet he kept his hand steady, insisting that form makes freedom possible, and that Italy could not be preached or charged into existence without also being budgeted into it. He knew Rome must one day be the capital, and he murmured his maxim about church and state as a way to reconcile an eternal city with a very modern administrative nerve center. Cavour did not live to see Venice or Rome taken. In June 1861, weeks after the new parliament convened, he died in Turin, the map incomplete and the machine already humming. In the final days, he is said to have repeated his principle of a free church in a free state, as if a motto might outlast his heartbeat and steer the compromise he would not be there to negotiate. Outside, trains came and went on rails he had willed into being. In ministries built to look older than they were, clerks sharpened pencils and filed papers labeled Italy, as if the word had always belonged in the drawer. On Cavour's desk, the lamp smoked and steadied. The telegraph key ticked its metallic pulse, and the pins on the map held fast while the hand that set them finally rested. He slept on straw and could take a city before dawn. The red shirt was not a uniform so much as a promise. Cheap, easy to wash, bright enough to be seen when dust and smoke turned the world to chalk. Giuseppe Garibaldi carried himself like a man who had misplaced ceremony and never bothered to look for it. His face wind-burnished, his words as spare as a sailor's knots. He was the sword of the risorgimento, not gilded, not delicate, but in the right hand and at the right hour, unstoppable. Born in Nice with the sea for a neighbor and the Savoyard crown for a distant landlord, he learned his trade on decks and in storms. A failed rising in 1834, Mazzini's gospel, spoken with too few converts, sent him into exile with a death sentence hanging like a shadow behind him. In South America, he found revolutions that needed sailors who could fight on land, and he earned the name Hero of Two Worlds by hammering courage across borders. Rio Grande do Sul's ragged republic, then Uruguay's defense against a larger throne. He learned to gather men who owned little and to march them at a promise, to live by speed and surprise, and to risk everything except his habit of refusing pay he had not earned. Italy drew him back as if a lighthouse were hidden in the hills. In 1848, he offered his blade to the peninsula's rising, then went south to Rome in 1849 when the Republic called. There, under mortars that pulled masonry down like rotten teeth, he fought a rearguard war through alleys and gardens while a Pope's city briefly practiced citizenship. Anita, his companion in battle and hunger, died in flight near Ravenna, and he carried that grief like a wound that never scabbed. The lesson he took from Rome's fall was simple and stern. When the right must retreat, retreat in formation. When fortune turns, turn faster. He sharpened victory before he spent it. In 1859, with Cacciatori delle Alpi stitched to their spirit, his volunteers harried Austrians along the Lombard lakes, winning at Varese and San Fermo, a guerrilla's handwriting on a campaign map that diplomats would later file. Then came the bargain he tasted like ash. Nice and Savoy bartered to France to keep a throne's favor and a war's momentum. A man cannot sell his birthplace and expect the seller's friendship. Garibaldi's fury at Cavour did not cool quickly. But the same temper that flared could be harnessed for audacity, and audacity became a plan with a date, a deck, and 1,000 men in red shirts. In May 1860, the red shirts slid from the rocks at Quarto and spilled ashore at Marsala, meeting Bourbon authority with speed, myth, and a tactician's instinct for where the map had seams. At Calatafimi, the first check turned to a surge. At Palermo, street by street, they taught an army used to parades how to lose a city to men who did not own boots in the same size. At Milazzo, they clinched Sicily with a fight that smelled of cordite and salt. When he assumed the dictatorship of Sicily, he spoke the phrase like an engineering term and held it in the name of Victor Emmanuel, a Republican lending steel to a monarchy because the work demanded it. Then the red shirts crossed the straits. Calabria folded, the Bourbon line, which had looked so thick from afar, thinned into uniforms without belief. Naples fell as quietly as an empire can. Garibaldi rode in as if entering a town he had always lived in, and the crowds made a category mistake that pleased them. They celebrated a man because they could not yet imagine a state. The danger now was that triumph would outrun strategy, that a march on Rome would turn a peninsula into an international incident. Cavour drove Piedmont's army through the papal marches to intercept him, and on the dusty road near Teano, two men met with the future balanced between their tempers. Garibaldi saluted Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy, handed over the south, refused rank and payment, and walked away as if victory were a coat he would not wear indoors. His sword cut again, and sometimes it cut too far. In 1862, he gathered volunteers to Rome or death, and at Aspromonte royal troops stopped him with bullets and an embarrassed apology. He was wounded and laid up, listening to his own body argue for patience. In 1866, during the Third War of Independence, he carried the tricolor into the Trentino against Austrian regulars, and when the cabinet ordered a halt after hard-won ground, sent the single word that made obedience sound like heroism: obedisco. A year later, he marched on Rome again, and at Mentana, French chassepot rifles stitched his volunteers to the ground with a new, terrible neatness. In 1870, when the French Republic needed a general against the Prussians, he commanded the army of the Vosges, lending his name and nerve to a war that was not his, because freedom was a borderless habit and he had cultivated it. If Mazzini was conscience and Cavour was calculus, Garibaldi was velocity. He distrusted politicians who mistook procedure for purpose and had no fondness for cabinets, including the ones that applauded him in public. With Mazzini, he shared a Republican faith but fewer scruples about using a strong hand to force the door liberty was too polite to open. With Cavour, he shared a talent for reality but none of the patience for small print. He could bless a king because a king could concentrate force. He could condemn a compromise because it smelled of the parlor. He was fractious, magnificent, inconsistent in the way of a storm that waters fields and rips roofs, and Italy required both harvest and danger to be born. His enemies called him reckless. His men called him general, with a pride that felt like kinship. He refused salaries he hadn't earned and honors he hadn't sought, used the same rough blanket in palaces and barns, and in the pauses between campaigns, he returned to Caprera, an island of stone and scrub where goats grazed and the wind invented older music. There he farmed, wrote gruff letters, received pilgrims who wanted to see the man who had marched maps into new shapes, and bathed a lacework of scars in seawater that did not care whom it salted. Parliament made him a deputy when it suited it and scolded him when it must. He returned the favor by speaking for the poor with the bluntness of a man who had command as his only rhetorical device. Garibaldi rarely gave Italy the government he wanted. He gave it the victories it needed. He made possible what others made permanent, and he never quite forgave them their permanence. His legend worked faster than the bureaucracy could file it, and soon schoolchildren learned the cadence of his campaigns as if they were folk songs set to a drum. In oil portraits, he looks almost tidy. In memory, he wears dust like a sacrament and the red shirt like a flare at evening. On Caprera, when the wind turned and the light fell low, he would wring a shirt over a basin and watch the water run red, not with blood, but with dye, the color of 1,000 promises rinsed clean and hung to dry in the salt air, the sword for once quiet beside the door. It began with a noise that sounded like hope learning to hammer. In March 1848, as Paris tore down one regime and put scaffolding under another, Milan's streets spilled into the open, maids with wet hair, clerks with ink on their fingers, artisans who traded mallets for paving stones. They tore Austrian cigars from soldiers' mouths to deny them the tax that paid for occupation. They built barricades so quickly that maps went out of date by evening. For 5 days, the city fought its garrison from windows and roofs, a vertical war of tiles and courage, until Radetzky pulled his troops out and the bells rang as if they had been waiting half a century to breathe. Venice lifted its own head. Daniele Manin, lawyers calm and rebels timing, rode the tide of crowds into the ducal palace, and the Republic of San Marco returned from the 16th century as if it had only stepped out for air. Tricolor flags flickered over lagoons and campi. Gondoliers became ferrymen of messages, and the arsenal remembered how to feed a revolution with steel. Across the peninsula, news traveled faster than permission. Bologna shouted. Palermo had already bled in January. Florence argued with itself and chose a louder dawn. The word Italy stood up, still thin from years of whispering, and tried its first public sentence. Kings felt the ground tilt. In Naples, Ferdinand II granted a constitution under pressure and then watched with narrowing eyes as troops pledged to march north against Austria. In Tuscany, Grand Duke Leopold's liberal mask hung straight for a moment. In Rome, Pius IX. who had glowed with reformist possibility, peered into the fire and stepped back from it. The Pope's April allocution put theology where war had tried to sit, no crusade against a Catholic emperor, not in his name, and papal troops, already on the road, were called home like a breath re-swallowed. The Bourbon contingent from Naples turned around soon after, under orders that mixed caution with contempt. A dream of the Italian princes together broke on the reef of reality in a single week. In Piedmont, Sardinia, Charles Albert did what a crown could still do. He declared war. The blue-coated Piedmontese crossed the Ticino with bands playing a tune that made Italy sound inevitable, and for a while the tune carried them. Peschiera fell. Goito shouted itself hoarse. The quadrilateral of Austrian fortresses looked a problem of courage rather than calculation. Volunteers came in a milling stream. Students in jackets a size too large for their intentions, veterans with eyes that already measured ground, while Mazzini wrote from exile with a blessing and a warning. Win, but win for a people, not for a dynasty's ledger. The field replied in harsher grammar. Radetzky, old and tireless, unspooled a counterstroke at Custoza in July that bent the Piedmontese line like a branch under wet snow. Retreat followed, and with retreat, the kind of arguments that ripen into grudges. Milan, now free and proud, found Piedmont's caution too cold. Piedmont found Milan's impatience too hot. Both discovered that improvisation cannot long substitute for command. Venice, behind its water and will, refused despair, but learned blockade's hunger. Rome tried to believe that reform could walk beside sovereignty without stepping on its robe. The summer sagged into negotiations. The autumn refreshed them. Winter brought more soldiers and fewer illusions. When the thaw came, the dice were still Austrian. In March 1849, with the Second War called to redeem the First, Novara answered like a slammed door. Piedmontese regiments, brave and outmaneuvered, broke under the old field marshal's steady hand. Charles Albert, who had wagered honor and found the table rigged by skill, abdicated to his son Victor Emmanuel II that same night. The indemnity demanded, 65 million francs, landed like a ledger stone on a kingdom that could barely afford its pride. The young king took the weight, and a constitution that Cavour would later turn from survival clause into national seed. For now, the music stopped and the flags hung. Elsewhere, the music grew martial and then went mute. Rome, in 1849, tried another form of courage, a republic announced by trumpets and laws, with Mazzini one of three to steer it, and Garibaldi carving a perimeter out of orchards and alleys. The French came to protect the Pope and stayed to end the experiment. The siege pulled masonry down in sheets, and the defense wrote itself into legend on staircases that ended at Skye. When the breach widened, the triumvirs resigned rather than pretend victory. Garibaldi led a column out through the night, Anita dying in flight near Ravenna on ground that seemed to tilt to carry her away. Venice held longest, summer into August, cholera as cruel as cannon, surrendering only when hunger could no longer be defied by patriotism or poetry. What failed in 1848 to 49 was not bravery, but coherence. The peninsula had produced uprisings by the dozen and governments by the handful, but their clocks refused to strike the same hour. Princes feared their own people almost as much as they feared Austria. Republicans feared monarchy as betrayal incarnate. Moderates feared that radicalism would turn foreign sympathy into foreign intervention with bayonets attached. The Pope, who might have been a referee, chose to be a boundary. The Bourbon South had a constitution the king treated like a loan he never meant to repay. Tuscany fluttered. Lombardy and Venetia learned again the taste of occupation. The peninsula was a concert without a conductor, and Radetzky was content to let the musicians tire themselves out between disciplined volleys. And yet those years put iron in the story's spine. The 5 days of Milan became a lesson in what a city can do with windows, rope, and nerve. Venice under Manin taught the arithmetic of dignity. The Roman Republic inscribed laws on the heart that would outlast the holes French shells burned into its walls. Victor Emmanuel kept the Statuto when prudence advised him not to, and Piedmont, licking its wounds, learned to speak constitutionalism, with a fluency that made European cabinets listen. Defeat clarified allies and enemies, and in the clarity stood a path, narrow, expensive, possible, by which diplomacy could purchase what improvisation had failed to seize. When the smoke thinned, Lombardy's fields lay flat again, and the Po moved as if history were not arguing on its banks. Barracks in Milan filled with the old cadence of German drill. In Venice, a woman folded a flag she had hidden beneath a mattress and slid it back, just in case. In Turin, a young deputy ran his finger under a sentence in a budget and saw, to his surprise, that it pointed toward a nation he could cost out. The First Italian War of Independence had ended with a crown humbled, a pope restored, a general triumphant, and a people, still plural, learning the difference between enthusiasm and endurance. On a winter morning, a soldier on guard in Novara stamped his feet for warmth and watched his breath rise and vanish, thin as a promise that would have to be spoken again, with more than courage to make it stay. It began as a whisper under alpine air, two men walking beneath linden trees in Plombières while servants pretended not to hear. Napoleon III wanted glory without ruin. Cavour wanted Austria's fingers pried from the Po without gambling Piedmont's future on miracles. The bargain they shaped was narrow and exact. If Vienna struck first, France would come with eagles and drums. When victory allowed, Lombardy would pass to Sardinia. And somewhere at the end of the ledger lay a quiet charge, Nice and Savoy, filed under later. A dynastic knot, Prince Napoleon to Clotilde of Savoy, would sweeten the ink. It was the kind of pact that looks modest on paper and enormous when it begins to move men and guns. Cavour read Europe like a balance sheet and saw the single line that could tip it: make Austria seem the aggressor. Through 1858 and into early 1859, he tightened Piedmont's mobilization like a screw, and placed troops where maps could be read as menace without firing a shot. Vienna obliged with the stiffness of an empire certain of precedent. On April 23, 1859, an ultimatum arrived demanding demobilization. Cavour rejected it with the calm he saved for calculations and watched the fuse catch. When Austrian columns crossed the Ticino, Paris could call the war defensive, and French trains, symbols of a modern empire's speed, began to roll soldiers toward the Alps, an iron procession that turned promises into timetable. The campaign opened with collisions that felt like proofs. At Montebello on May 20th, French cavalry and Allied infantry stamped their names into the soil. At Palestro days later, Victor Emmanuel II, muddy to the knees and grinning through powder smoke, led Zouaves and Sardinians across canals and dikes, as if the landscape were a chessboard he had memorized. Towns along the Lombard roads rang bells as they had in 1848, but now their hope had uniforms to greet and schedules to rely on. The Allies crossed the Ticino. Lombardy seemed to tilt toward them of its own weight. Austrian commanders fell back, not broken, but reconfiguring, and Cavour's pencil moved from contingency to expectation with the careful joy of a man who hears the numbers align. Magenta on June 4th was a red word even before the newspapers printed it. French corps fought through orchards and villages where the names of saints on street corners learned new meanings in smoke. Sardinian brigades held the seams. Railways near the field served both as arteries and as obstacles, modernity cutting the ground into hard decisions. Milan opened its gates 2 days later with a pride tempered by memory. This time, there were no barricades, only salutes and hurried embraces while officers looked past the crowds to the next ridge. For a moment, the war felt solvable by momentum. Men wrote letters that promised harvests and weddings, as if the world could keep 2 calendars without conflict. Then the sky lowered over Solferino and San Martino on June 24th, and the arithmetic of battle turned to agony. Under a heat that bleached color from uniforms, tens of thousands hammered at one another across hills braided with vines and stone walls. Commanders lost regiments in the thickets of smoke. Villages, Cavriana, Solferino, San Martino, became nouns for suffering. Wounded lay in stacks where shade permitted. Water ran pink and then red. The cries did not end at dusk. A Swiss traveler named Henry Dunant stumbled through the chaos and assembled villagers to bind wounds without asking for uniforms. a human gesture that would, in time, become the Red Cross. But on that day, the effect on Napoleon III was immediate and unnerving. He had wanted a campaign. He had found a vision of war that could not be sold to Paris twice. Strategic anxiety lined up with moral revulsion. Reports drifted in of Prussian restlessness along the Rhine. Austria, though battered, still held Venetia and the Quadrilateral. French supply lines, strung out across rivers and rail, had begun to fray. The emperor calculated that triumph had reached its profitable limit and beckoned to Franz Joseph for a parley. At Villafranca on July 11th, two sovereigns agreed to fold the map without finishing the game. Lombardy would pass to France and thence to Sardinia. Venetia would remain Austrian. The central duchies, Parma, Modena, Tuscany, were to be restored to their princes, as if a clause could guide not only cabinets but crowds. It was a classic French exit wrapped in diplomacy, the honor of intervention preserved, the costs caped, the door closed quickly. In Turin, the ink was still wet when fury arrived. Cavour read the terms and saw not prudence, but mutilation. He had built a path through investment and blood toward a unified north, and the emperor's recoil left the road ending at a ditch. He resigned in a blaze of temper and exhaustion, slamming the cabinet door on a king who had to blink twice before choosing duty over rage. Yet even in defeat, the facts changed. Lombardy was Sardinian now. The Statuto still breathed, and in the central states where restoration had been promised, citizens and provisional governments declined to play the parts assigned them. The National Society fanned into committees. Plebiscites were whispered as remedies. A current ran through Tuscany and Emilia that no signature at Villafranca could reverse. France had not withdrawn its hand without naming its price. The promise laid aside in Plombières, Nice, and Savoy did not disappear when men returned uniforms to closets. It waited like a bill in a drawer. Napoleon III, needing proof to his chambers that blood had bought more than gratitude, pushed for consummation. In March 1860, under the Treaty of Turin, plebiscites staged on the French model offered legitimacy. The ceded territories would be the coin by which Paris balanced its own ledgers of honor and loss. For Piedmont, the charge would be paid to keep the larger account open. For Garibaldi, born in Nice, it would sting like betrayal inside the triumph to come. Still, in the summer and autumn of 1859, the peninsula felt different when the wind moved over it. Milan was no longer an Austrian garrison town. Tricolor ribbons hung in shop windows as if they were ordinary merchandise. Telegraphs clicked a new name, Italy, with a frequency that made it sound less like a wish and more like a habit. Veterans of the 5 days watched French eagles depart with a respect mingled with relief, then turned to the work of persuading neighbors that union with Piedmont could protect courts and livelihoods better than any return to duchies. Diplomats packed their trunks. Journalists rewound their metaphors. Priests weighed sermons against censures. The aftershocks of Villafranca loosened stones in walls no one had meant to rebuild. At Solferino's fields, harvesters later found buttons and bullets among the vines, small iron testimonies to an afternoon when Europe remembered what modern killing costs. In Paris, the emperor studied casualty lists beside a silver pen he did not lift as easily as before. In Turin, Cavour, out of office but not out of will, sat with his gloves off, staring at a map whose edges looked nearer than they had a year earlier. Rails cooled, tents folded, and somewhere in a prefecture a clerk stamped the word Lombardy on a form and then for the first time filed it under Italy. On a shelf behind a minister's desk lay an envelope with a neat hand on it. Nice and Savoy, the paper pale and perfectly smooth, waiting for the moment when the price of help would be taken from the drawer and paid in full. The bill for French help came due on white paper edged in diplomacy. In March 1860, the Treaty of Turin set its figures: Savoy and Nice to pass beneath the tricolor, legitimacy to be laundered through plebiscites staged in the French style, and gratitude to be expressed as arithmetic rather than memory. Ballot boxes arrived like furniture for a room already arranged. Officials stood ready to count what had been rehearsed in committee. Cavour read the ledger with a statesman's calm. By surrendering the Alpine shield and a strip of Ligurian coast, Sardinia purchased room for Italy to breathe. a north coherent enough to bend the peninsula toward itself. On maps pinned in Turin, the sacrifice looked tidy. In the mouths of patriots who had sung of a single fatherland, the word cession tasted like a thread pulled from a beloved coat. For Giuseppe Garibaldi, it tasted like betrayal, salted by origin. Born in Nizza, he had carried the city's light and sea on his skin across 2 continents, and now the city would wake to a different anthem while he was told to applaud the logic. He did not. In Parliamentary Hall and in printed pages, his anger flared, not theatrical, but edged, an accusation that the statesman's abacus had tallied up a mother and sold her to save the child. He did not forgive Cavour, and forgiveness was not asked. Both men understood that the price just paid would demand a counterpayment of action. If a strip of coast had been traded to buy a war's promise, then a war, or something like one, must be undertaken quickly before Europe could change its mind again. Southward lay the Bourbon kingdom, heavy with ritual and light on trust. In Sicily, taxes grated against thin purses, and conscripts felt the draft as exile. In Palermo, the allies had learned how to turn a procession into an argument. In the countryside, men hid old muskets as if they were heirlooms. Garibaldi read the island as a seam in the fabric of the peninsula. Pull here, and the south might come away. Pull cleanly, and the whole garment could be re-sewn under a new label. He began to gather men in Genoa and at Quarto, the rocky suburb where the sea throws its voice against the land. 1,000 volunteers in mismatched boots, 1,000 reasons that added up to one color. Money arrived by subscription and miracle, rifles by favor and theft, and 2 steamers, the Piemonte and the Lombardo of the Rubattino line, would carry the plan like guilty secrets. Turin officially disapproved. Unofficially, it practiced the art of strategic blindness. The government could not sanction an invasion that might hand Vienna or Paris a pretext to intervene. It could not, either, crush a movement that was rapidly becoming the country's most compelling sentence. Admirals received instructions to enforce neutrality with the discretion of men who understood what neutrality might cost if observed too strictly in the exact hour when history needed it bent. Cavour spoke of order and the law, Garibaldi of duty and the people. Between them lay the gray sea where statecraft and insurrection could shake hands without witnesses. On the night of May 5, 1860, under stars refusing commentary, the 1,000 slipped from Quarto's rocks and let the Ligurian darkness close behind them. The passage was a contest between speed and fate. Off Sardinia, Bourbon ships hunted, the red shirts evaded, the sea briefly their accomplice. On May 11th, they came into Marsala's roadstead while British warships, sentinels of trade and caution, lay at anchor, their flags unruffled by the politics below. Bourbon guns fired too late, too wide. Boats bumped the shallows, planks slammed a stone, and men in dyed shirts stepped into Sicily with the practiced grace of sailors taking a strange deck. They marched inland along roads lined by hedges of prickly pear and rumor. At Calatafimi 4 days later, volunteers charged uphill through smoke and scrub, and a phrase shouted in the tumult, later polished by textbooks into destiny, ran ahead of them like a banner you cannot see but can feel in your throat. The island learned the sound of urban war. In Palermo at the end of May, Garibaldi's columns slipped into streets mapped by balconies and laundry, and the fight spread from courtyard to courtyard while residents lowered ropes and food, and sometimes bullets, to men who were both soldiers and sons. The Bourbon general Lanza, astonished to find that every corner had a plan and every barricade a captain, negotiated a truce that barely contained the inevitable. Within days, the city was effectively in rebel hands. By July, after Milazzo, Sicily was a red shirt possession stitched together by speed, audacity, and a talent for turning victory into administration without pausing to admire it. Garibaldi took the title Dictator of Sicily with the unceremonious air of a man borrowing a tool, and he held it in the name of Victor Emmanuel, a Republican's formula for lending revolution to a crown without interest. Yet, he governed by gesture and decree, cutting old taxes that punished the poor, flirting with land reform in a landscape where the great estates had their own weather, and assigning portfolios to men who had been, weeks earlier, only nouns, student, printer, notary. There were excesses. There are always excesses when order changes clothes. But there was also a contagious sense that things could be done without waiting for a duke to die or a prefect to frown. Meanwhile, letters flew to Turin like sparks. The South was falling fast. The experiment had achieved ignition. Would the state acknowledge the chemistry or try to smother it with protocol? Cavour answered by watching even more intently and by measuring day by day the risk that the next step, across a narrow sea, would transmute a local wonder into a continental crisis. In August, across they went, with ferries the color of patience and bravado. At Reggio Calabria, the Bourbon line buckled. At the sight of villages cheering men in red cotton instead of blue wool, its cohesion sagged into a sequence of rear guards and apologies. The road north unrolled like a ribbon pulled from a drawer. Towns surrendered by appointment. Officers changed sides with the tired dignity of men who prefer to join the future rather than be lectured by it. On September 7th, Garibaldi entered Naples as if he were returning a borrowed city, the streets roaring, the royal family already en route to Gaeta with luggage full of the past. What followed was at once delicate and reckless, a dictator without a bureaucracy, a populace ecstatic and anxious, a European audience that clapped with one hand and reached with the other for an atlas. Cavour could feel disaster knitting itself in Rome if he did not cut the thread with state action. The French garrison there made the city an international tripwire. A red shirt march on the Holy City would give Paris a reason to occupy not just a shrine, but a peninsula. In September, he sent the Piedmontese army through the papal marches with orders and excuses, beating papal troops at Castelfidardo and reaching the Neapolitan border with the polite determination of a guest who intends to rearrange the house for the owner's good. The message to Garibaldi was unambiguous, even without a letter. Finish the South, fold it into the crown, and leave Rome to a later equation. The mutiny had accomplished what cabinets could not. Now the cabinet asserted its right to turn victory into law. Nice and Savoy were gone. Sicily and the South were coming in. That, in essence, was the conversion rate of 1860, the ledger that explained to Europe why borders had blurred, and to Italians why rage could be made to pay a dividend. In Genoa, a woman who had sewn a red shirt for a son traced with her finger the path he had taken on a map where Nizza was no longer ours. In Naples, a dock worker raised a glass to a king he had never seen, and to a general he had seen at arm's length. In Turin, ministers aligned codes for regions that shared only proverbs. The expedition had been a miracle disguised as logistics and a mutiny disguised as destiny. On the beach at Marsala, long after the last cannon had been dragged away, a plank lay gray and splintered where men in coarse cotton had stepped from one country into another. Boots wet, paper ballots settled forever in a ballot box hundreds of miles behind them. In the wake of Villafranca, the middle of the peninsula behaved as if it had understood the plot before the actors had finished the scene. Parma and Modena set up provisional governments that spoke the language of respectability in the morning and union by evening. Tuscany's committees, sober and efficient, treated annexation not as romance, but as municipal housekeeping writ large. Newspapers followed a choreography of editorials and petitions. The National Society sent organizers whose handshakes felt like ballots. Cavour, back at his desk, turned enthusiasm into paperwork, commissions, envoys, instructions, and France, while watching for affronts to its dignity, allowed the current to run as long as it did not become a flood against Rome. The North had been won by war and armistice. The center would be won by forms. Plebiscites arrived in spring like a civic harvest. In Emilia and Tuscany, voters marked papers that asked for union with Sardinia, and the returns came back in numbers so lopsided that skeptics could only complain about the handwriting. The pageantry was modest. Polling places under arches where market stalls usually stood, officials with ribbons that matched a mood already past argument, priests who frowned and then shrugged. When the results were carried to Turin, they sounded less like applause than acceptance. A kingdom, it seemed, could be grown by asking towns to write their names under an agreement everyone had already signed in their heads. Annexation followed as quietly as the posting of a new street sign. The quiet ended where the Pope's temporal belt cinched the waist of Italy. To open a corridor to the south without tripping European tripwires, Cavour sent the Piedmontese army into the papal marches in Umbria with a face of regret and the speed of necessity. At Castelfidardo in September 1860, papal troops, valiant, outgunned, broke under the precision of men who had been trained to fight Austria. At Ancona, the sea and artillery finished the argument. Plebiscites again supplied the seal, and the map now showed a continuous road from the Alps to the doorstep of Naples, with Rome deliberately left like a candle one does not snuff while guests are watching. Diplomacy called it prudence, strategy called it oxygen. South of the Garigliano, the red shirts had made reality outrun paperwork. Naples, shaken by the shock of an army that moved like rumor made solid, had chosen spectacle over resistance. Sicily was already stamped with decrees signed in the name of Victor Emmanuel. The danger was not defeat, but victory in the wrong place. A rush on Rome would invite French bayonets and reset the ledger to zero with interest. So the Piedmontese came from the north, and Garibaldi came down from the hills, and near Teano on a dusty road, the two lines met. A king in a plain tunic and a general in a weathered poncho saluted one another, and with that gesture the South folded into a crown it had tested with rebellion. In Naples and Palermo, plebiscites ratified what the streets had already declared. Turin became the nerve center of a country that had existed yesterday as a wish. On March 17, 1861, the Parliament proclaimed the Kingdom of Italy. Venice and Rome, notably absent, but the spine and limbs connected at last. The Statuto Albertino, born as a Piedmontese charter, became the country's constitution. Codes were harmonized, tariffs straightened, conscription regularized, rail timetables and telegraphs rethreaded across provinces that shared saints but not schedules. Ministers wrote as if the state had always been there and had only mislaid its letterhead. Clerks in new prefectures learned to stamp Italy without pausing. The machinery clicked into motion with a confidence that tried to outrun the old habits it was meant to replace. Beneath the optimism, friction sparked. The church had lost lands in Piedmont and influence across the annexed center. Bishops weighed protest against pastoral care, while cabinets rehearsed the phrase, "a free church in a free state," as both principle and shield. In the South, the shock of unification arrived as tax rates, draft notices, and officials speaking a northern cadence. A handful of Bourbon officers and many desperate men retreated into the hills, and brigandage, part rebellion, part banditry, all grievance, began to etch a darker counter-narrative on the new flag. Roads that had carried heroes now carried constabulary. The work of making Italians proved harder than the headline of making Italy. In cafes that had cheered Garibaldi and cabinets that had toasted Cavour, the conversation shifted from triumph to treatment, and yet the state learned. It sent engineers as well as infantry, school teachers as well as tax collectors. It built rails that crossed conversations and bridges that shortened suspicion. In Emilia, mills moved to a national tempo. In Lombardy, investors read balance sheets that now included Sicily as something more than a myth. In Tuscany, jurists sanded the edges of codes to fit the hands that must use them. The parliament spoke loudly, and sometimes foolishly, but it spoke in one room. Newspapers mocked ministers and taught readers what a minister was. In barracks from Turin to Bari, boys learned to curse in one another's dialects and to laugh at the same sergeant, which is a kind of grammar too. Two absences defined the horizon. To the northeast lay Venetia, still under the Habsburg key, its fortresses square on the map like clenched fists. To the west, by south, Rome, a city of marble and caution, where French bayonets turned allegory into policy, and the Pope's shadow fell across plans drawn in every ministry. Italy's new borders held like seams pinned for the next fitting, one eye on Vienna and the other on Paris, and every rail laid and school opened doubled as a promise that when the day came, those absences would be filled without tearing the fabric. For the moment, the tricolor was a flag and a bookmark, marking a chapter that could be reread but not yet concluded. On an evening in Turin that spring, the gas lights burned in ministry windows while the Po slid past in a color that did not care for politics. In a room that smelled of paste and ink, a clerk slipped Kingdom of Italy into a drawer label where Sardinia had been and pressed it flat with his thumb. Far away, in Venice, A sentry's bayonet caught the last light as if it were a thin slice of promise. In Rome, a French bugle cut the dusk in a key that did not harmonize with any parliament. Between them, the rails hummed, the wire clicked, and across a map newly stitched together, the cloth held, with two bright pins still piercing it where the seam was not yet sewn. The summer of 1866 opened like a hinge on which the map would swing. In Berlin, Bismarck set his iron puzzle, and Prussia's quarrel with Austria offered Italy the one arithmetic that might buy Venetia, alliance in exchange for pressure on the southern front. In April, a treaty joined Turin to Berlin, quiet on paper, loud in consequence. If Prussians struck north, Italians would strike east, and the Habsburgs would be forced to divide their gaze. For a nation still learning to walk, it was a chance to lengthen the stride without marching alone. Italy's plan split its weight between two fists. The army of the Mincio, under La Marmora with the king nearby, pushed toward the quadrilateral of fortresses that guarded the Lombard plain. The army of the Po, under Cialdini, was to swing wide and fall on Venetia from the south. It looked clean in dispatches and tangled on the ground. At Custoza, Archduke Albrecht met the Piedmontese columns with disciplined counterstrokes and a cool eye, and by evening the blue coats fell back over bridges they had boasted of taking at breakfast. The tricolor still flew, but the wind had shifted. The news reached Florence in ink the color of apology. At sea, the lesson was harsher. Off Lissa in July, ironclads met like ideas, their armor new and their doctrine untested. Admiral Persano shifted his flag in the smoke and confusion. Admiral Tegethoff drove Austrian prows like chisels into Italian hulls, and the Re d'Italia rolled and sank in a single horrifying moment while the Palestro burned to her bones and vanished in a bloom of black. The fleet that should have been a promise dissolved into silence, the Adriatic closing over its shame with the same calm it had shown to triumphs past. Fishermen brought up splinters in their nets and said little. The charts did not change, but confidence did. On land, one arm stumbled while the other kept its balance. Garibaldi's volunteers moved through the Trentino with the economy of men who know the price of each foot of altitude. Montesuelo tested them, Bezzecca rewarded them. When orders came, armistice, withdraw, the message pushed against the grain of victory, and Garibaldi replied with a single word that belonged to discipline as much as to legend. Obbedisco. He turned his column around like a shepherd turning a flock at a cliff's edge, the mountain echoing both their boots and the unsaid. In that obedience was a kind of citizenship rarer than charge. Then the thunder from the north resolved everything that local courage and local failure had left unsettled. At Königgrätz, Sadowa, on July 3rd, Prussia shattered Austria's main army, and the Habsburg government learned in a day what attrition might have taught in months. Diplomacy moved at the speed of necessity. Vienna offered Venetia not directly to Italy, too bitter, but to Napoleon III as mediator, who would pass it on with due ceremony once the plebiscite blessed the transfer. By October, the Treaty of Vienna sealed the exchange. In the weeks around it, referendum papers in Veneto and Mantua said yes, with a unanimity that was partly conviction and partly relief. Austrian eagles came down from public buildings as quietly as they had once been hoisted. Keys were handed over with formal bows and unsentimental hands. The new kingdom collected its prize with the awkward grace of a man receiving an heirloom he had always claimed as his. Engineers and prefects traveled ahead of parades. Customs barriers vanished like toothaches. Railway timetables exhaled with the pleasure of lines now meeting without permission. Trieste and Trentino remained beyond reach, a lesson written into every school atlas. But Venice, Mirage, and Stone returned to the conversation not as a subject of nostalgia, but as a city with a ministry and a budget line. In Florence, the capital since the September Convention had moved it from Turin, cabinet secretaries smoothed maps on tables and penciled new routes from Lombardy to the lagoon, then looked south toward a city they dared not yet touch, because Rome still lay under a foreign umbrella, and umbrellas can be weapons when held by emperors. The September Convention had promised French troops would leave the Pope's city if Italy, in turn, would keep her capital elsewhere and restrain hotheads. Italy obeyed, and the garrison withdrew in 1866 when France went to war, but everyone understood the condition. Disturb the temporal power, and the blue coats would return. After Lissa and Custoza, Italy had no appetite for a sermon with bayonets attached. Cavour's maxim, a free church in a free state, had become a prayer for patience and a formula for delay, and for now the formula held. Yet even with Rome deferred, the country felt more like itself when the tide ran through Venetian canals and the tricolor crackled against salt wind. Veterans of the 5 days and of Solferino walked the Riva as if measuring whether memory fit the new reality. Gondoliers learned the shapes of a different administration and kept rowing. In schoolrooms from Udine to Verona, boys repeated dates that had once been rumors and were now lessons. In barracks, they learned to curse the same sergeant in accents that still betrayed birthplace, and to sing the same marching songs that pretended those accents were already won. Markets adjusted, laws aligned, and a map that had flickered began to stay still. On a damp morning in Piazza San Marco, bells swung and struck the air until pigeons scattered like confetti. A tricolor unfurled from a staff where, for generations, another flag had watched the lagoon, and in the water the new colors lay trembling and sure, a ribbon drawn by tide. In the same light, far away, a French sentry in Rome adjusted his kepi and glanced along a wall whose stones remembered emperors and popes and sieges, the bayonet at his shoulder catching the sun as if to remind the peninsula that one door remained locked. Venice belonged again to the nation that had dreamed her. Rome waited behind its own reflection, the Tiber sliding past in a color that promised, without speaking, that gates do not stay closed forever. After Venetia, the map looked finished, except for the city that had once defined maps. Rome remained like a held breath, protected by French bayonets and by the scruple that Europe wrapped around the papacy as if doctrine were a fortress. The September Convention had moved Italy's capital to Florence and promised patience, and for a while patience felt like policy. Cabinets rehearsed Cavour's formula, a free church in a free state, as both principle and sedative. Trains ran, schools opened, taxes were collected under a single seal, and yet every timetable and ledger seemed to stop a page early, as if the nation had been bound with one chapter missing. Rome was an absence that made the whole presence tentative. Impatience tested the line. In 1867, Garibaldi slipped past restraints and gathered volunteers for the old refrain, Rome as destiny, not debate, and the hills around the city heard again the footfall of men who believed speed could outtalk law. The Italian government, fearing an explosion that would summon an emperor, tried to bottle the storm and then watched it smash the glass. At Mentana, French troops fighting for the Pope unlimbered a new rifle whose bite wrote its own verdict across the olive groves. The redshirts learned that courage can die on technology's schedule. Garibaldi's legend bled and walked away, wounded in body and in pride. A lesson settled. Rome would not be taken while France could still spare a finger to press on the scale. Then Europe rearranged itself in a month. In July 1870, Napoleon III hurled France against Prussia and discovered too late that his empire was thinner than its eagles. By September, at Sedan, the emperor folded with his army, and a republic rose in Paris atop a ruin that could not hold a distant garrison. The umbrella over Rome snapped closed by necessity. French troops left the Pope to his own walls, and the Italian cabinet understood the hour without any need of alarms. Victor Emmanuel II sent a letter seeking a peaceful solution, entry to guarantee the Pope's spiritual independence while ending his temporal power, and received a refusal as firm as stone. Pius IX, stubborn as a cliff, would yield only to force, and then only enough to mark that the force was there. The Italian army moved with the decorum of men approaching a shrine and the clarity of men completing a job. General Raffaele Cadorna deployed batteries along the Aurelian walls, where time had already gnawed at brick and travertine. Papal troops under General Kanzler, Zouaves in foreign accents, Romans in borrowed uniforms, stood to their posts with an honor that knew it was outnumbered. The bombardment began before dawn on September 20th, light shells tapping and then punching until a section near Porta Pia loosened like a tooth. Dust lifted into the pale sky and drifted toward domes that had watched Goths and emperors and were unmoved by either. Orders on both sides were careful. The Pope demanded resistance sufficient to show that sovereignty had not been surrendered, not slaughter. The Italians demanded speed to keep the day from inviting a European rescue that would not, in truth, come. When the breach sighed and opened, the bersaglieri ran. Plumes shook as they crossed the ditch and poured through into the streets beyond, rifles low, hearts high, not as looters, but as locksmiths finally turning a key that had taken a century to cut. There was fighting, short, angry, confused, around garden walls and at corners where courage meets bad luck. Then white flags began to appear, and the sharp stutter of rifle fire collapsed into scattered shots that sounded embarrassed to be heard so late. By noon, the Vatican raised surrender. Cadorna sent couriers and orders. Rome, which had woken to the sound of modern artillery, was quiet by mid-afternoon, the city's great silence gathering itself back up from the cobbles. The ritual afterward belonged to paper and to memory. Italian troops occupied with restraint. Proclamations promised the Pope inviolability and dignity. The Quirinal Palace was set aside for a king, and ministries began to locate themselves along streets whose names carried emperors in their syllables. A plebiscite followed in October, its result clear enough to be called inevitable. In 1871, the government moved the capital to Rome, and the tricolor learned how to hang from stones older than the word nation. Parliament passed the law of guarantees to define the Pope's status and privileges inside the city he no longer ruled. Pius IX rejected the arrangement and declared himself a prisoner, beginning a quarrel that would outlive everyone present and describe a century's worth of Sundays. Italy had taken the city at last and discovered a new problem inside the old solution. Ordinary Romans who had watched popes and princes through peepholes in history adjusted with the flexible pragmatism of people who still had to buy bread. Bakers learned a new stamp. Clerks learned a new letterhead. Soldiers in new uniforms guarded gates where old uniforms had posted notices in Latin and French. In Trastevere, children used mock epaulets in games that made yesterday's defenders into today's pretend villains or heroes, according to whatever story an uncle decided to tell. In the Jewish ghetto, torn down soon after, families stepped into streets that sunlight entered freely for the first time in centuries. The city's life began to thread itself through ministries and markets, smell of ink and oranges, rumble of wagons and Latin chant, and the nation learned how its own heart sounded when it beat beneath 7 hills. The breach near Porta Pia did not close. It was framed and kept, a scar turned into a monument. Pilgrims came to look at the ragged edge where stones had fallen forward like teeth loosened by a blow. Veterans traced the lines with calloused fingers and told the barest of stories. Swiss guards stacked halberds in a drill yard that suddenly seemed small, and Zouaves with complicated passports took ships for home, leaving behind buttons and a handful of foreign words in Roman alleys. At the Quirinal, carpenters measured rooms for a king. Across the river, a white figure in a palace ringed by gardens insisted, with the force of an idea, that he had not left, that time had moved around him without permission. Toward evening, the Tiber carried a faint dusting of mortar into its slow curve, and a flag rose over a city that had taught Europe to speak of empire, now learning to speak, carefully, awkwardly, magnificently, of a republic of citizens under a crown. The light caught the tricolor and held it, and for a long moment the cloth did not move at all, as if the air itself were giving the country time to believe what it had done. After the thunder at Porta Pia, a quieter labor began, the kind that uses ink more than gunpowder. "We have made Italy. Now we must make Italians." The line passed from mouth to mouth like a proverb that stings, captured the gap between a map that finally held and a people still arranged by parish, dialect, and habit. The tricolor flew from Rome's ministries, but in kitchens from Udine to Palermo, dinner prayers named saints and villages before they ever reached for the nation. The new state had a body. What it lacked was a shared pulse. Administrators set about manufacturing one from paper and punctuality. Prefects, long-fingered, tidy men with the authority of distant signatures, took up residence in provincial palazzi. The king's voice on streets where yesterday a duke or a bishop had spoken last. The Casati school law spread like a chalk line from Piedmont over the peninsula, and soon the blackboard became a frontier where dialects rubbed against Tuscan Italian and found, little by little, a common grammar. The lira replaced a chorus of local coins, measures standardized, rail timetables stitched noon to noon until time itself learned to run the same in Bari as in Turin. For every decree that made Italy feel coherent, there was a mutter in a market that reminded clerks that coherence is a courtesy earned, not imposed. The South answered with silence that broke into gunfire. In the hills of Basilicata and Calabria, bands gathered under names that looked like legends and lived like hunger, half rebellion and half banditry, all resentment. Emergency laws gave the army wide teeth. Villages learned to fear a knock that came before daylight. Women laid out bread and water on tables for conscripts, and for the men who hunted them, because both were cousins. Old Bourbon loyalties mixed with new grievances. Taxes that bit. Conscription that felt like exile. Anti-clerical measures that arrived in the wrong season. And the Southern question took shape as not just a disparity of coin, but a chasm of trust. By the mid-1860s, the Brigand War had been bludgeoned into sullen quiet, yet its memory hung in doorways like a coat that no one would claim. Meanwhile, Rome sat inside the nation like a paradox, carefully arranged on a mantle. Parliament passed the law of guarantees to ring the papacy with dignity and leave its spirit untouched. The Vatican refused the gift and locked its gates from the inside. Pius IX called himself a prisoner, and the non-expedite taught Catholics to treat elections as affairs for other men, souls first, ballots never. So the new state learned to speak without a great part of its people answering back. In the streets, processions and parades crossed without collision. A statue of a saint borne shoulder high past a column of infantry, incense and pipe smoke mingling, each rhythm ignoring the other without quite denying it. A free church in a free state sounded noble in cabinet rooms. On Sundays, it sounded like two choirs rehearsing in adjacent chapels. The chamber itself behaved like a school that had yet to agree on a curriculum. Suffrage was narrow, property and literacy drew the line, and politics ran on notables, favors, and the careful algebra of keeping a ministry intact through the week. The right clung to order, the left spoke of widening rights. Both learned the sport of transfusion, trasformismo, long before the word became notorious, bargaining men across aisles until programs thinned to survive. Budgets bore Cavour's old ambition and new constraints. A national debt to service, rails to lay, ports to deepen, and a conscription to finance that would make the army both a sentinel and a school. In 1868, the grist tax returned to fill the treasury, and the poor learned again how policy can sit in a loaf like a stone. Riots answered, and the government discovered the price of arithmetic done over empty plates. And yet, beneath the frictions, unification acquired texture. Teachers fanned out in suits that shone at the elbows, carrying primers where the alphabet marched beside a little flag. Children traced letters that tasted strange at first, and then became the sound of future wages and distant news. In barracks, boys from Sardinia cursed in Piedmontese cadences and answered jokes from Apulia in words they'd never heard at market a year before. Sergeants enforced a rough equality with a talent for profanity that ignored parish lines. Postmen learned surnames across provinces. Newspapers found readers in towns that had never seen themselves in print. A song learned in one valley was whistled, off-key and stubborn, in a coastal street a month later. The state did not ask hearts to change in a day. It asked hands and ears to learn the same tasks. Economics cut the country along older seams even as it promised new cloth. In the north, an industrial triangle began to glimmer. Turin's foundries, Milan's workshops, Genoa's docks, while Lombard banks learned to see beyond the Po to insurance and investment in a language Paris would lend at interest. The south moved more slowly, bound to latifundia and seasons, its capital coy and its credit dear. Some years the difference could be heard in the sound of winter shoes. Steamers at Genoa and Naples began to leave with more than cargo. Men with folded jackets and a photograph tucked under a shirt, bound for the Plata or the Hudson, exporting hunger in exchange for remittances and stories told over summer visits. The lira entered the Latin monetary union, looking respectable in European company. Tariffs rose and fell as ministers tried to decide whether the future was to be bought by protection or by courage. Even culture learned to travel in uniform. A small book called Cuore would, in a few years, teach schoolchildren kindness in a Tuscan that reached classrooms the way rain reaches rooftops. And veterans associations held dinners where toasts practiced, awkwardly, a national rhetoric. War memorials multiplied in stone and bronze, humble, local, while the enormous whiteness that would one day dominate Rome's skyline crouched in blueprints and in arguments about taste and taxes. Engineers did as much as poets. Bridges taught rivers to serve schedules, and telegraph keys let merchants' friendship cross hills that monks had measured with steps. Cities named streets for battles and thinkers, and by walking the route to work, a citizen memorized a lesson he had not sat to learn. None of it was simple, and little of it was quick. Governments rose and fell with the season. The Roman question stayed a quarrel immortal by habit. The Southern question returned whenever harvests failed or promises proved thin. But the country acquired a way of continuing. Fires were put out, roads repaired, budgets amended, and each year more boys returned from service with a vocabulary that would let them quarrel with a tax collector without changing languages. In parish ledgers and factory rolls, in school registers and shipping manifests, Italy stopped being a headline and became the polite line at the top of a form. At dusk in a Roman schoolroom, chalk dust hung in light that came in at the angle of an evening prayer. A teacher pointed to a map where borders no longer quivered, and a boy sounded out the name of the country clearly, as if it were a word learned for the first time and recognized at once. Outside, boots of a carabiniere snapped the stones with metronomic confidence. Across the river, the dome of St. Peter's kept its own weather. Down on the embankment, the Tiber held the sky like a blade, and in the breach at Porta Pia, the air moved through the notched stones as steadily as breath, the flag above them softening and then stiffening in a wind that now belonged to a nation teaching itself how to breathe together. On some evenings, the country sounds like its own memory. The bell in Turin that began the sentence, the hammering at Solferino, the breath held at Porta Pia. A red shirt dries on a line in Caprera. A lamp still burns in Cavour's old office. In London's damp, a stack of pamphlets remembers Mazzini's hand. Rails cross the Po with a low iron hymn. The wire clicks a word that used to be a wish and now behaves like weather. In a schoolroom, a child traces the outline of a boot and says the name without stumbling. Night thickens on the domes, on vineyards, on harbors that know every departure and every return. And somewhere a flag lifts in a small wind, then settles, like a lung learning at last to breathe in time.